Good afternoon and welcome to the next of our socially distancing in the workplace seminars. Today we're going to be talking about factories and what you need to do in your business to look at being COVID secure going forward. First of all, I'm just going to welcome our speaker this afternoon, which is Paul Peacham from ARCO. He'll be taking you through what they've done and what they've implemented in their situation to help make sure they're COVID secure. I'll be taking the second half of today's session and I'll talk a bit more about risk assessments and a bit more about what you actually need to do. I'll be looking at the government guidance that has been released and kind of summarising some of the main points that you need to consider when you're looking at reopening or continuing to operate in a COVID secure manner. I'd like to say that this is funded by the Grow My SME programme through the Humber Growth Hub. And if you've got any questions or want to look at any of the further workshops that are running, please do contact the Humber Growth Hub to see what is available. Do encourage as many questions as we can throughout the whole session. And Paul will be taking questions at the end of his session, and equally I'll be taking questions at the end of mine. You should see a little box questions on your dashboards that should allow you to be able to type any questions in that you have. I would suggest that as the questions come to mind, stick them in there so that they'll come up, because there is a slight delay on that one, and that makes sure we can go through all questions and try and answer as many as we possibly can at the end of each session. So as I say, we encourage that. That's what we're here for, to try and answer as many as we can. So what I'll do is I will now pass you over to Paul, who will sort of take you through what they've done in their situation. Paul, over to you.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Peter. Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Paul Peacham, and I am the Health and Safety Advisor for Supply Chain within ARCO. I'm based at the National Distribution Centre in Hull, but obviously I look after other functions in terms of our production facility in Preston. This is where we do heat seal and embroidery of garments, and our hose assembly area in Hull also. So our guys there make hose assemblies for a whole host of industrial applications. So today, I'm going to briefly take you through some of the steps that we've done within the business. Obviously, we have not shut throughout the situation for obvious reasons, in terms of we are the UK's biggest supplier of PPE. So firstly, just a little bit about the NDC. So we have just over 400,000 feet of warehouse space, and this includes a new facility which opened at the beginning of this year. We can house up to 40,000 pallets, and at this current moment in time we are very close to maximum occupancy in terms of what we are currently storing on site. We have over 250 colleagues who work on site, and this includes agency workers. The number of agency workers generally flexes between our busiest and our less busier part of the years. And we also operate a 3-shift tier system. So we do a 6-2, 2-10, and a 10 p.m. till 6 a.m. Sunday to Friday. So in terms of some of the things that we've done within the NDC and particular supply chain, one of the most important things to do is to carry out a risk assessment in your particular area or your facility. It's crucial, as well as being part of the government guidance, that all the particular hazards in relation to coronavirus are identified. Obviously, this will allow you to put control measures in place to reduce any risk to as low as is reasonably practicable. One key thing here to mention with regards to risk assessments is that it is key to involve the workers, so people who work on your site. For us as a business, we included our SHE committee members and other various members from different areas around the site. So this could be people from our packing facility, our goods receipt facility, our mechanical handling equipment area. A whole host of people were involved in the risk assessment so that we could make sure that it was suitable and sufficient. It's also key in terms of risk assessment, once you've actually done it, is that you communicate it to everybody. This includes familiarisation with the document, you know, in terms of training and getting sign-off from everybody. And what also key to remember is that this risk assessment is live. So it's not a risk assessment that's going to go away anytime soon. As the guidance changes from, you know, Public Health England or the government, it will also change as well. So as it does, obviously it needs to be revised and reviewed as and when it needs to be. So that's one of the key things that any business needs to do in terms of staying COVID safe. Some of the other things that we did to protect our people on site was that we immediately cancelled all customer visits. Now here at the NDC, we could have anything up to 4 or 5 visits a day from our customers and potential customers. For obvious reasons, we didn't want anybody putting that at any unnecessary risk. We cancelled all non-essential maintenance and contract works. Obviously, legislative requirements in terms of LOLA or pure, you know, this is for your lifting equipment, forklift trucks, anything to do with Legionella. Obviously, those legal requirements still remained as is, but any non-essential works was cancelled. Because of the large number of people on our site, we also decided to stagger the start and finish times of breaks. So we have a half-an-hour window between the end of one shift and the start of another shift. This then allows for people to leave site in a timely manner without overcrowding in particular areas. This could be the locker area or an entrance gate, etc. But it also gives enough time for the people coming onto site. So where people would generally congregate in canteen areas, this would be a lesser number, and we could minimise the crossover in terms of the shifts. We also included additional break times. So we used to have 2 breaks throughout a shift. It is now 3. We've also introduced new areas in terms of where these breaks are, obviously to keep people at a social distance. You know, wherever possible, we need to put into place that 2-metre piece, and we've done that quite successfully as a site at the minute. We've put up social distancing and hygiene posters. Now these are on display in all areas of the site, and a little bit later on into the presentation I've got just some pictures to show you all in terms of what these look like. But I think it's key, obviously from a worker point of view, that these posters are displayed, reminding people that they do have to keep 2 meters apart. You know, they do have to wash their hands before and after eating their lunch or, you know, having a drink and that kind of thing. So all of that's in place. We also introduced markings on our walkways, and at the NDC we have lots of walkways. So where the main pedestrian activity is, these have been marked out with tape at 2-metre intervals. And as I've alluded to already, I'll show you a couple of pictures as we go through the slides. We've implemented sanitising stations around the site, in particular at the entrances. It's key at the entrance points to any site that, you know, people have facilities to sanitise their hands. We've also got wipes in place in all key areas, whether that's on a wet bench or a packing bench, or whether it's on equipment. They're all over the site. We've also increased our cleaning frequency. So we're quite lucky here at the NDC. We have a cleaner or cleaners who clean the site regularly. Now this has been increased 4 or 5 times more than what it usually would be. So before and after breaks, then at regular intervals throughout the days, and this includes cleaning of all areas. So toilet and welfare facilities, workbenches, it's a whole host of other areas. And then we've also done is we introduced PPE. Now as a site, it's a requirement for us guys to wear high visibility clothing and safety footwear. But we've also made available face masks for colleagues who wish to wear one. Now, I must stress that it's not mandatory for them to do so, but we need to do it obviously to remain compliant with the guidelines in terms of making sure it's available if needed. And I have to say, I've been on the shop floor today, and as of today, nobody's actually wearing a face mask, which for me demonstrates that the guys working on the shop floor feel comfortable and safe in their working environment. Let's move on to the next slide. What we've also introduced is a COVID secure checklist. Now, this isn't just for the NDC and supply chain. We've introduced it in all of our retail outlets as well, as they've begun to open over the last week or so. So what this document does is it's basically a checklist for a manager to use, and it's down to the manager to complete the question set to ensure that all relevant measures are in place to control and minimise the spread of coronavirus. It talks about the risk assessment, it talks about shift patterns, it talks about speaking to people, getting their feedback, government guidelines, it talks about the social distancing piece, and it also talks about our workplaces and workstations. So as a site, we have a cleaning regime in place where all works areas will be cleaned by the operatives at the end of their shift. This includes equipment, which it could even be a forklift truck. We do require the guys to wipe their equipment down at the end of every shift. And what we've done is we've implemented a policy for if you have to operate a piece of equipment, whether it's a forklift truck, you own that equipment for that shift to minimise use with other people. Which has it's worked out really, really well. And then on the back of that, once they've done that, I will then do my own check with the same checklist. So basically, it's just to demonstrate, obviously, best practice and compliance, but then any findings that I find, we can compare with the previous findings and put any actions in place in terms of remedials where we need to. So we've not only stopped there, so we do have a number of vulnerable colleagues and agency workers who will be coming back to work shortly. So what we've done with these guys is we have completed what we call a reboarding checklist. So it's designed to ensure that those coming back to work are given the necessary training in terms of bringing up to date with risk assessments, any site briefs that we've had, that they clearly understand the symptoms of the virus, and if they are showing symptoms, then they need to self-isolate. So we've got that, in place, and then at the end of that, we get the colleague to sign that off along with the line manager. Again, I briefly mentioned hand hygiene posters. Now, these two posters are available on our website, but we've also got them displayed all over site. It basically gives somebody, the general idea in terms of how to wash their hands and keep them clean. So the 20-second rule, sanitising, how to wash your hands properly, the do's and don'ts, etc. So those are in place all over site as a reminder to colleagues and agency workers. So I'm just waiting for the next slide to load up. Okay, here we go. So this is just some of the information that we have at site entry points. Now, we've got two here at the distribution centre, and for us it was just key that we mirrored those at both entry points. Now, the 2020 that you see there is the 20-second hand rule, and the 2-metre distance and the 0 excuses. You've probably seen this maybe knocking about on other websites, but we think it's a really good visual reminder to remind people of the socially distancing piece that we do have on site. I mentioned walkways, so as you can see, we have chevrons on our pedestrian walkways. These are marked at 2-metre intervals, and these are in place throughout the warehouse. So people can see these as a visual reminder that they must keep their distance from one another. And what we've also implemented is at the end of a shift time, when people tend to leave site, we've started managing those walkways. Because we did have a couple of instances where people were getting quite close together, so we wanted to negate that. So we now have managers on the walkways, making sure people adhere to the 2-metre distance rule. And then you'll see that's just some floor signage saying 2 metres apart. Again, signage which I've just touched base on. This is just an example of some of the rooms that we have. So on the left-hand side, this is one of the ladies' toilets. And you can also see that we've limited the maximum number in terms of occupancy. So whereas before it was basically an unlimited number, now we've deemed that 2 in these areas is the adequate number. So far today, it's working quite well, but obviously that will stay as is for the foreseeable future. And again, on the right, just same type of thing. This is a small meeting room, but it's reminding people to be socially safe. And again, the maximum occupancy in that room. So in terms of how we've demonstrated compliance, obviously we've used the government guidelines for working in factories, plants and warehouses. This allowed us to, make sure that our risk assessment was suitable and sufficient, that we had adequate measures in place to reduce the spread of the virus, but also that our colleagues and agency workers felt safe when they come to work. Because obviously what we don't want to do is anybody to come back to work and feel unsafe, because that's just completely the wrong thing to do. And then in terms of demonstrating compliance, obviously I've talked about the checklist, which I will have undertaken and the managers undertaken. It's only then do we sign the sign off and we display the COVID Secure in 2020 certificate. This then demonstrates to people coming on site, whether it's an employee or a visitor, that we meet the 5 steps in terms of a safe workplace. And there we go. Okay, thank you for that. I'll hand you back over to Peter. If there's any questions, I'll kindly answer.
Thank you very much for that. That's really informative. We do have a few questions coming in. Okay. So let me just get those up. So the first question we've got is in regards to PPE.
Yes.
It's, what type of face mask do you require your employees to wear?
So what we've introduced is we have introduced the FFP3 because this gives the user maximum protection. We did look at P2s, but we felt that an FFP3 would work better. But it's also interesting, I alluded to mention earlier as well, is we have given our first aiders specific PPE kits. So obviously if they're treating somebody, a casualty who has had an injury, obviously we want those guys to feel safe. So they've also been issued with their own PPE kit, which contains FFP3s.
Okay. Thank you very much. The next question we've got is, have you had any reluctance of staff to return back to work?
Not that I'm aware of. Obviously, we've remained open right from the beginning of this pandemic, and we had our first person come back at the beginning of this week. Obviously, they were taken through the reboarding piece, and from my point of view, I've not heard any feedback in terms of reluctancy. Obviously, that's a good thing, because obviously we want to get people back into work, but we need to do it effectively and safely. But at the minute, there's been no resistance.
The next one is, I think, regarding to things like flash jackets and stuff like that. Do you have a requirement for those to be washed each day?
Not currently, no. We did look at that, because obviously if anybody wearing high-vis clothing or any kind of clothing, there is potential for the transmission route in terms of the transferring onto garments. But we deemed that it would be not necessary given the current controls that we have in place. And also, if anybody's showing symptoms, then obviously they shouldn't come to work in the first place. But we did consider that as part of one of our control measures, but we deemed it not necessary.
Okay. Do you have any areas in the site where people must work less than 2 meters?
We don't. We're quite lucky in that sense, because we've kind of got the 3 shifts and it's large enough area to kind of split people out. We do have, it's like, I'll give you an example, is the packing benches. We have these opposite each other, but they're quite tall, and these the benches are more than 2 meters, more than 2 meters from one person to the next. So we've got more than enough space to get people past. But I think it's key to note here that obviously the 2 meter distancing is wherever possible. So it's like in any workplace, there will be instances where people may need to get closer than 2 meters. Now, if that would be the case, obviously we follow the government advices where you you avoid face-to-face contact, you go past the person side to side or back to back. That's how we manage that.
I've got another one, which is, have you had any issues with employees using public transport?
No, we haven't. I kind of thought we might have had some issues with that, but what we did was ARCO has been extremely good to all employees. We were given 100 surgical face masks by the business a few weeks ago. So anybody who does travel on public transport, obviously now it's mandatory to wear a face mask. They've got that without any issue, but as of yet, I've not heard anything from anybody.
Okay. I think that's the last question of that. Oh, sorry, one more has just come in. Just saying that, and that's to do with sanitization. Or do you have to sanitize boxes going out?
No, we don't do that. We obviously one of the considerations right at the beginning of this was, are we getting boxes delivered that could be potentially contaminated? Are we sending stuff out which could have the virus on it? So no, we don't do that. Obviously, all the workstations have sanitizing stations. So this could be hand wipes or hand sanitizing gel. We encourage people to wash their hands regularly throughout the shift. So from that point of view, we don't require that. It's good hygiene that we encourage for our guys.
Okay. They're still coming in. So I've got another one, I'm afraid, which is
all right.
How do you control loading and unloading of goods?
So it's quite good. I mean, obviously, depending on the type of delivery that we get, let's say we get a few parcel deliveries in the back of a van. We get the driver to reverse into an area, and he offloads the goods onto a box. We have a station where if there's any paperwork, he puts it into a box to minimise any interaction with our guys. He will then drive off, and then we will obviously get the boxes and the goods and then book them in. But in terms of if we're unloading large containers that have come from overseas, we've recently introduced, we've bought some unloading equipment which has significantly reduced the number of people having to unload a container. So this is one person task inside the container, and then at the other side, at the back end where the conveyor is, we have pallets either side. We only have one person either side of that to minimise contact, so we can effectively manage the distancing between people. But obviously, we've got a cleaning regime in place for that as well.
Yeah. Thank you very much. I say some really good questions there, and it's great to see so many questions. I have to say, really pleased that we are getting those through, and that's what we're here for. As I say,
absolutely.
That's what. So I think that's all the questions we've got for the moment. As I say, okay. I'll be going through questions at the end of my session as well. So if you do have any, keep putting them in. I'll try my best to answer. But thank you very much, Paul.
Okay. Again, thank you very much for having me. I hope everybody's found it useful.
Yeah, I'm sure. Definitely some really interesting and really pictures there. I've got to say, just showing how it is practically implemented is really, really good.
Yeah, and I've got tons of pictures, but you can go a bit picture crazy. So just try to. But if anybody gets any questions, I'm more than happy to take these on a separate call or a separate email. More than happy to share best practice. If anybody wants to get in touch, it's no issue from me.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you, Paul. So I'm going to take you through the next part of the session today.
Okay, thank you very much.
And I'm just going to introduce myself first of all. My name's Peter Daniel. I'm a senior business advisor for Blue Orchid and NEBOSH accredited health and safety advisor. And just to give you a bit about my background, I kind of started, I'm going to say, in the construction industry, and I had my own business after that, before starting with Blue Orchid. So one of the things I want to make clear here is I like to look at health and safety from a very practical point of view. I'm trying to look at it from a way that can be implemented in the workplace in a way that people can actually follow and actually use. So I'm going to take you through and start looking at health and safety and look at more about risk assessments what you need to do a COVID risk assessment in a way, hopefully, that is, as I say, practical rather than going through, this is what you must do. This is what you must do. What I'm going to go through in today's session, first of all, I'm going to talk about social distancing and exactly what it is, because we need to understand what social distancing is so that we can put that into place and implement that in our risk assessments. I'm going to look at who you need to protect, who do we need to think about, and then I'm going to go through how you actually complete a risk assessment and go through I'm going to say the do's and the don'ts. It's more the do's that you need to do to complete a risk assessment. One of the things I want to say here, and I'll say several times through this, is you are the person, the business owner, the person who's going to be running it, the manager in charge. You are the people who need to be able to do the risk assessment, because you're in the best position to be able to do that, because you know your workforce, you know your site, you know your business, and you know what needs to be done. I'm then going to look through the government guidance. So the government have introduced or have put out various documents, and one of the pictures was actually on Paul's slides there of documents about what you need to do, and there is one on factories. Now, I've gone through each of these, had a look through and picked out the main aspects of these. A lot of the time, your business will cross over more than one of these documents. So have a look at each one that is relevant to you. So you might have one for factories, you might have to look at the vehicles one, you might have to look at the offices one. But hopefully I've picked the main parts out of the ones that will be most relevant to you with factories and that. The next thing I want to talk about, cleaning and sanitizing, what we do there, PPE and face coverings, as I know that's quite a big aspect and a big part and questions that come in from that one. And finally, looking at existing risk assessments. Because one of the things that you'll find through your risk assessments is you will need to make changes. Your COVID risk assessment means you need to make changes. Those changes could impact on your existing risk assessments. If they do, you need to review those. And risk assessments should be reviewed regularly anyway. But I want to go through exactly which are the main ones that you might need to look at going forward. So, what is social distancing? Well, we all hopefully have heard this before. We all hopefully are fairly due to this one now. Social distancing is keeping a distance, a physical distance between yourself and others while outside the home. That is because COVID-19 is usually transmitted by droplets in the air. And a lot of the time that will come from just you normally breathing. It's not necessarily sneezing or coughing, although that has a huge impact. It's just normal breath produces droplets in the air. And that is one of the main ways that it will get transferred. So social distancing and the distance between people means that those droplets are less likely to be breathed in by others. The current recommendation, and I say current, is 2 meters or 6'6", 6.5 feet. That is the current social distancing regulations at the moment, and is what we look at adhering to. Now, I will talk about, I'm going to say, the elephant in the room, which is the fact that is it going to be reduced down to 1 meter or changed, as lots of other countries have done. I don't know. The answer to that one is I don't know, and nobody knows, because until that decision's made, we don't know. Now, what happens if it is? That doesn't necessarily change anything for you, because you'll need to do your risk assessment and you need to do what you feel is best here. And you may decide to keep that 2 meters. One of the things that is for sure is that the further you are away from somebody, the less likely you are of having the transmission. The transmission is greatly reduced the further you are. So you may decide that you are going to keep that 2 meter rule, even if it is changed. Even if it is changed. So it's not something you need to be too concerned of at the moment, because what you're looking at when you do your risk assessment is whether you can be COVID secure and whether you can maintain social distancing at any point. One of the questions I know I've been asked 2 or 3 times recently is about signage and what happens if they change it. Well, yeah, they change it and signage may have to change. But if you are still keeping that 2 meters in place, you don't have to change the signage. And you may well be able to look at signage in a way that some of it may not have to be changed if you decide to reduce that down. But currently, 2 meters is the standard, and until we get told otherwise, that is what we need to work to. The other thing actually to mention here is this final point on this slide, which is about reassurance. And again, Paul touched upon this one, that he was fairly confident, and I think it is shown by people wearing the masks, that his staff are fairly confident and reassured that it's safe to work. I've put shop and spend here because this gets transferred outside your workplace, outside the factories, into the normal habits of your workforce, and the confidence, the mental health of your workforce as well. They need to feel safe. They need to feel safe. When we start looking at health and safety legislation and what that means, and I'm sure most of you are fairly au fait with current health and safety, that nobody should attend or has to attend an unsafe workplace. What do we mean by an unsafe workplace? Well, a lot of the time that is somebody who just doesn't feel safe. So if you've got somebody who is reluctant to return to work, and you've gone through and made sure you are COVID secure, a lot of the time it's not to do with the measures you've put in place and them not being adequate enough, as much as the communication for you to your staff. As I say, I've put shop and spend, so customers also come into this one. People need to feel safe. People need to feel safe for you to be used from the customer, but also from you as an employee. And I think that also came up with one of the questions about decontaminated boxes going out. Is that because people are more likely to buy them if they feel they're safer? I don't know. I don't know. So very quickly, who are we protecting? Well, one of the first things I'm going to say here, COVID-19 hasn't changed any health and safety regulations. They are still there. It's just a new threat. It's a new risk, and it's a new risk that you are going to have to look at. So nothing changes there. You're still doing a risk assessment in the same way as you've done every other risk assessment in the past. The legislation still is the same. So Section 2 of the Health and Safety at Work Act is general duties to employees and their employees. It's the duty of every employee, I'd always get my tongues tied up here, duty of every employer to ensure, as so far as reasonably practical, the health and safety and welfare at work of his employees. You need to make sure it is safe for your employees. You need to put an environment in place that it is safe for your employees. Now, there is several reasons for this one, but the main ones that I am going to say is A, it's good practice because you do not want your employees to be at risk. But 2, it is also good practice because it allows your workforce and your ongoing work to continue uninterrupted. There was those 2 main aspects that you are looking for protecting your workforce. First of all, it is good practice for your employees. Secondly, continuity of the business. I'm going to start off with just half a dozen points, which I think are the very, very key points when we're looking at COVID-19 and who we are protecting and things that we need to consider. I will go through more specific things in more detail later on. But I just wanted to bring these at the very start of the presentation because they are so important. The first one, and I'm sure a lot of you would be doing this anyway with other sicknesses as well, but if staff members are not well and showing any kind of symptoms, no matter how small, of the illness, they should not attend work. You may therefore need to look at various policies you've got, various risk assessments you've got, and one of the ones that I would suggest everybody looks at is your sickness and your reporting of sickness policies. First of all, employees need to be confident about what the process is. So I would share your sickness policy again with your staff. Make sure they are fully aware of what happens if they are unable to attend work because they are showing symptoms. It's all to do with that communication. Communication is key. Yes, it's probably in their company handbook. Yes, they probably already know it, but reinforce that. One of the things I'll be talking about is what, on several times, is that communication. And I always talk about it in terms of red lights, traffic lights. We all know to stop at a traffic light. We all know a red light means stop. The reason we know that is because we've been told many times. I'm going out with my lad who's, sort of 8 years old on the bike fairly regularly at the moment, especially with the nice weather. And I am drilling into him. Red means stop. Not go past that. If it says it's on a red light, even if it's clear, you do not go past it. And I'm telling that day in, day out. Eventually, it'll click with him. I think it hopefully clicked with him now, but eventually it will definitely click with him, and he won't even think about it. So communication is the key. So even if you feel that they know these policies, communicate them again. It doesn't hurt. You're not doing anything wrong by communicating them again. So I'll communicate that. The other thing I'd look at here is the reporting process. How do staff actually report that they are unable to attend work because of COVID-19 symptoms or any illness for that matter? Make it easy for them to do it. Make it simple. Make sure they know how to do it, so that this process is second nature to people, so they are more likely to do it. The easier it is to do it, the more confident their people are, the more likely they are to do it. And just reducing these people who come into work who are feeling a little bit under the weather, showing symptoms, will reduce the spread. So easy reporting any issues, sickness, and also I'll put improvements there. And what I mean there is if somebody does have something that they say, well, why don't you do this? Why don't you do that? Or why haven't you done that? That is a reassurance thing, because you can see what the main issues are, but also they may well have a better idea than you. Yeah, don't take that away. There's a hive mind there. The more people thinking about a problem, the more likely it is to be solved. And they might come up with a more efficient, a better way of solving something, or a more safer way of doing something. So do take those improvements on board and have that staff interaction. Now, one of the things I put in here is daily reminders of briefings, and that's the same reason as the traffic lights. I said, you need to hammer home what people need to do. People need to feel safe and confident. People need to know what they're going to do. Now, when I say daily reminders and briefings, this could be in the format of posters. We see a lot of that. Signage, marks of tape on the floor, things like that are daily reminders. But it also could be those toolbox talks. I think toolbox talks are one of the best ways forward. Yes, there are issues in terms of group meetings, something I'll talk about a bit later on, but look at ways you can do this. The other thing I'm going to suggest here, even for staff, is things like this, social media and stuff like that. Have a look at using existing methods you've got, which you may not have thought about. Make sure people are confident. That's what it's all about. So maybe you want to put up what you've done on your social media channel. That is a great marketing aspect for your customers, because they'll see that you are taking control of the situation. You are still pushing forward. You are still going forward. But also, I can guarantee that a lot of your employees will follow things like your social media feeds, and you can use that as communication to them as well. Social media has gone up massively use in the last few months. So let's use it to our advantage. Make sure any enforcement is clear, consistent, and you do it. And you do enforce any breaks in that, in the same way as if someone walked around your factory without wearing their standard PPE in terms of flash jackets and things like that, you would stop them. You would enforce the fact that they are not compliant. And that's the same with things like social distancing. Same with the policies and procedures you're putting in place. There is no change there. So make sure you enforce it, but make sure that enforcement is consistent and they know what it is. They know what it's for. So clear, consistent enforcement measures. Access to PPE and welfare facilities. And I think the welfare facilities are probably more important than the PPE in terms of the control measures. Because when we start looking at control measures, we're looking at things you need to put in place. And we know from all the advice that washing hands is the most important thing to stop the spread. If PPE is required, they must have access to it. There's no two ways about it. They must have access to it. But people need to have clear access to it, to those PPE and those welfare facilities at all points. Again, Paul mentioned this about on all their stations, they have access to hand sanitizer. They have access to washing their hands. So make sure that's in place. And you may or will, I'm going to say, need to implement more areas that people can wash their hands or use hand sanitizer. So these are the, I'm going to say, the main aspects that we'll be talking about. Next one I'm going to mention is RIDDOR. I'm not going to go into too much detail in RIDDOR, but I will say that COVID-19 is a RIDDOR reportable incident. So this is, if it as an unintentional incident at work has led to somebody's possible or actual exposure to coronavirus, it must be reported as a dangerous occurrence. So I'll leave that to your situation because that is very much based upon your situation. The example I've used before, is mainly for things, I'm going to say site visits is the obvious one, where you visit a site, you're doing work in somebody's home or something like that, and unbeknown to you, the person has coronavirus, so there's been an exposure at that point. That would be a RIDDOR reportable incident. I'm not going to be downhearted on this one and say as a worker dies as a result of occupational exposure. Hopefully we're putting enough into place that neither of these are ever going to come into place, but the chances are the first one is a possibility. Hopefully for everybody, the second one never ever will take place, hopefully. The next thing I'm going to talk about is customers. Now, you may not be a direct customer facing business. You may not have a shop front, but you do have a duty to protect your customers in the same way as your employees. And that's in the processes that take place. You may have customers come in and picking stuff up from you, coming and picking up various items that you've manufactured. They may have to come onto site for that one. So you need to look at your policies and procedures at that point as well. Like Paul said, they used to have a lot of customers come in and doing site visits. You might need to think about that and whether that's going to continue or whether measures are going to be put in place for that continuing. But anytime you do have the same duty to protect your customers as your employees. The difference is they're often a lot more difficult to protect because they don't feel in the same way that they, I'm going to say, toe the line. They're looking for that, they're in their own charge at that point. So again, it's down to that clear signage and things like that, and people knowing what they need to do. They will still follow the rules, and they still need to follow the rules in the same way. Customers need to feel safe when shopping, and that means they need to feel safe to use you. If they don't, they'll go elsewhere. They won't necessarily tell you about it. They'll just go elsewhere. So this is something you need to bear in mind. You need to, again, communicate to your customers exactly what you're doing so that they feel safe in using you. Whether that's they feel safe because your supply chain is going to stay intact, whether you're not going to have issues with sickness and illness or anything like that, whether it's to do with the transfer of goods or anything like that, they need to feel safe. And again, I'm going to mention your marketing here, your websites, your social media. You need to think about using that to say exactly what you're going to do. Okay, so let's talk about risk assessments. Now, the first thing I'm going to say about risk assessments, there are lots of people I've seen advertising on various things, LinkedIn being probably the main one, saying we'll do a COVID-19 risk assessment for X, Y, and Z. Now, like I said at the start, I'm going to say you need to do it. You're the person in charge. You're the person who knows your business. You're the person who knows your workforce. So you need to do it. These generic ones that you can get off and pay a few quid for and get done, I'm going to say are almost not worth the paper they're written on. You can use them as a template. Fine, not a problem at all. Use them as a template. But you need to add specifics in there for your business, how you're going to do it. So make sure you do it yourself. And I will say, I've had a look at the ARCO website, and there is a good template for that on there, which you can download, and it's totally free for you to download to start you off. So if you are looking for one, there are plenty of places you can get those free templates for. But the risk assessment is no different to the risk assessments you've done in other aspects of your business. So you don't necessarily need that, I'm going to say, COVID specific one, because you're the one who's making it COVID specific. You're the one thinking about your business. So in terms of risk assessments, do it yourself. It is a do it yourself sort of situation. The next thing I'm going to mention here is, how long does a risk assessment need to be? And that's a question I get asked all the time. How long does my risk assessment need to be? Well, first of all, it needs to cover all the aspects of the hazards, people at risk, etc., etc. We'll go through that in a bit more detail. If, however, it's getting too long, split it up. Do more than one. So you might have, instead of doing a risk assessment for COVID-19 for your site, you might do a risk assessment for COVID-19 for the entrance, a risk assessment for COVID-19 for the packing area. Make them smaller, make them manageable, make them bite-sized. One of the things with a risk assessment is it should never be a dusty document. It's not a document that should be filed away. It's a document that should be used. My view of it is it should be a grubby document, because people should be thumbing through it and having a look at what they need to do regularly and actually reading it. So think about your workforce here. Think about what they would read. Think about how long it should be for them, and make it in a way that they can understand it. So how long should a risk assessment be? It's how long is a piece of string, but generally speaking, not too long. If it's too long, people won't read it. Split it up, do more than one of them, and just have several of them. People will read more than one document, more than one short document, but they won't read one long document. So as I said, split it up. So let's go through how to do a very simple risk assessment. And I want to just talk through the process of how I would go about doing a risk assessment. The very first thing I'm going to say here is get your clipboard out. Get your pen, your paper, your clipboard out, or your iPad, or however you want to do it in modern technology. That's the way I'd do it. Pretend you're an employee. Pretend you're a customer. Pretend you're you as well. And go around the site and see what the risks are. And it is a case of jot them down. Make a list of them. Go through and say, well, that's one, that's another, that's another. So let's take a very, very straightforward one, and that's somebody arriving to work. Normal process is I drive up to work and I go and park myself in the car park. I get out, I get my bag out, and I walk up to the main front door. Right, first risk, opening the front door. I mean, actually, there's probably risks before that, but let's take opening the front door. I've got to touch the handle, pull the door, and open the front door. There's a hazard there. Hazard is touching it. We know that coronavirus can live on surfaces. I'm going to say up to 72 hours. That seems to be the general rule at the moment, but there are lots of sort of varying degrees of that in terms of where it is, type of surface, etc., etc. But let's just assume 72 hours. There is a chance that somebody else has touched that door. Somebody else has, I'm going to say, put coronavirus on there. I'm not sure put is the right word, and it is being transferred. There is a hazard there. So we go through each and every hazard as it comes through. What are the possibilities? The next thing we look at is who is at risk. We look at the people at risk. So in this case, it's your employee. The person arriving at work is at risk because he's touching a contaminated surface. You might have other people at risk, but usually it's going to be the person you're, I'm going to say, pretending to be. You may also have risk of your customers coming in and touching that said same door, or you may be touching that same door. So we're looking at the person at risk. And again, we just make a list of anybody who would be at risk. So anybody who could touch that door. The next thing we're going to do is evaluate that risk. And I try and do that on a scale of 1 to 10 on 2 different forms. So I put 2 different columns down and say, a scale of 1 to 10, what is the risk involved? Okay, so the one I'm going to first of all say is, what is the chances of something happening? What is the chances of something happening? So I'm going to say, first of all, what is the chances of that person having to touch that door and it be contaminated? Well, the more people on site you've got, the higher that risk. So the more people who touch that door, the higher that risk. The fact that he's got to touch that door means it's a fairly high risk. So let's arguably put that at 7. The chance of that door handle being contaminated and him having to touch it and getting that contamination on him is 7. Okay, as I said, it's an arguable figure, but it's a figure. The second one I talk about is the risk and what's likely to happen. Now, we know COVID is quite a contagious disease. It's something which transfers from person to person very, very easily. So we'd put a figure, a number on that. Now, that figure may be, let's say, arguably 6. I'm going to put it as arguably 6, fairly high contagion rate. If that door was to, say, the canteen, where the next thing the person's going to do is pick up a sandwich and eat it, I would say it's even higher than that, because the contagion would get into the body a lot easier. So think about that. That will change depending on where that door's going to, what the risk is, etc., etc. Realistically, we want things to be 0. 0 means no risk. 10 means it's definitely going to happen. You'd put money on it. So we're assessing the risk on those 2 levels. Once we've done that, we can add them together and see what the chances of something happening are. The higher the number, the higher the chance. And we can sort of prioritize the risks that we need to take out, the risks we need to lower down. And what we're trying to do here is we're looking at these risk controls. What do we need to put in place to reduce that down? What are the things that need to be done to reduce that down? We look upon it in a very straightforward way. First of all, we try and eliminate the risk totally. If we can eliminate that first number, that second one becomes irrelevant. So if that first number is 0, there is no risk. And that's the easiest way of solving it. So let's take 2 ways of taking that number for opening that door down to 0. First one, nice and straightforward one here. Work from home. They're not coming in, they're not having to touch the door. There is no risk. Simple as that. So look at your staff. Look at your staff patterns. Look at, do they actually need to be working in the site, on the site? So this might be office staff, admin staff, things like that. They don't have to come in. There is no risk. We don't have to do anything. Great. So we've got that first number down to 0. Now, I know that's not practical for a lot of people. I know that's not sensible for a lot of people. But if we can reduce it down for some, those few people make all the difference. Second one, again, would be open the door. Have the door on an automatic opener so the door is not touched. I would probably say this wouldn't reduce it down to 0, because how many of you have touched an automatic door? I'm sure most people have at some point. So there will be a risk there, but it's a lot lower. It's a lot lower. Yes, there's a cost involved to that. Yes, that's something we need to factor in, but there are other ways we can look at it for no cost option, and that could be prop the door open. But then this brings me on to other risk assessments and why we need to start looking at other risk assessments. If you're propping doors open, what does that mean? How does that change your fire regulations, the other risk assessments that you've done? So we're looking at bringing those numbers down as low as we possibly can. Okay. If we can't reduce that first number, the door has to be closed, the door has to be opened, we're looking at reducing down that second number. And that's where things like washing your hands come in. The person opens the door, washes their hands straight away, the chances of that contamination is reduced drastically. So, okay, we're going to put hand sanitization station straight after that door. Again, reduced down that risk. Then we're looking at recording findings. You need to record your risk assessments. And as I say, most people end up doing a risk assessment, sticking it in a file and forgetting about it. It's not really what a risk assessment should be. It should be communicated. It needs to be on file, but it also needs to be communicated to everybody. HSE say that if you've got over 5 employees, you have to have it written down. Under 5 employees, you don't have to have it written down, but you still have to do it. You still have to have a risk assessment. So why not write it down? So I don't like that one at all. I think it's a misnomer. I think it's something that throws a lot of people. You have to still do a risk assessment. So write it down. It's the easiest way of communicating things. It's the easiest way of people knowing what they need to do. It's the clearest way of people knowing what to do. The other thing I'm going to say here is, where do we put it? Well, everywhere that needs to have it. I'd be putting it up on the notice board. I'd be emailing it to my employees so that they can see it. I'd also be putting it on my website. And certainly the advice is, if you've got over 50 employees, you do put it on your website so people can see what you're doing. But again, I would say under the 50 employees, everybody, it's good practice to do that. It shows what you do. And the other thing, when we're talking about that confidence side of things, you've spent time, you've done that. You've come on this course to learn how to do that. You've come on this course to see what you need to do. So you're obviously somebody who is very proactive in finding out what you need to do. So get the credit for it. Use it as a marketing tool as well. Get the credit for it and be that one step ahead of your competitors. So do share it as much as you possibly can. Monitoring and review. And I kind of touched upon that with the 2-meter rule. Things are likely to change. It will change going forward. Risks change. And only this week they've announced about the new drug that has changed things going forward. Probably not necessarily directly for you, but certainly will change things going forward for how lockdown is eased. We need to keep abreast of that one. We need to monitor it. We need to review it. We need, again, to get feedback on it, to see how it's working, see whether it's affecting things. So you need to monitor it. You need to review it. How often should it be reviewed? First of all, any significant change. If there's a significant change, it needs to be reviewed. I'm going to say this one probably early on needs to be reviewed daily. If not, moving on to weekly, it certainly needs to be, I'm going to say, daily at the moment. And that can be a case of, yeah, nothing much has changed. Let's have a look, or let's see how it's working when it's in the practical workplace. Hang on, we need to tweak that. And again, Paul mentioned this, that they put these walkways in place with the 2-meter signage, the 2-meter barriers and things like that, and they found that people weren't adhering to it. So they reviewed their risk assessment and said, right, we're going to get somebody to enforce it. Yeah, so monitor and review it going forward. Okay, so let's look at the measures in place. Now, the very first thing I'm going to say here is on the .gov.uk website, I've got some links at the end. There is the guidance there. Have a read of it. Yeah, you need to have a read of it. And in actual fact, for government guidance, it's set out in a very good, well-mannered method, to be honest, with some nice little tick boxes and some things that you can look at and implement fairly easily. And so, as I say, for government guidance, it's pretty good. It is pretty good. So I'm going to start off just with a few pictures. I'm afraid, unfortunately, a lot of my slides don't have that many pictures because I've tried to put as much information as I can. But I did want to start off with a few. The first one is a lift, and this is one of the points I'm going to make here. You need to consider all aspects of your workplace. You also need to think about how your staff interact. You need to think about the mental well-being of your staff. You need to think about how people are confident. I think this one is probably the extreme example here. I would not feel confident going into that lift, and I would not go into that lift unless I absolutely had to, because realistically, it doesn't look very nice. It doesn't look a very great way of traveling. And again, the same comes with public transport. And I know, as I say, a question was asked earlier about anybody having any issues with people arriving on public transport. I've got to say, it's not something I'm looking forward to. Having to put a mask on, sitting there on public transport with that mask on is not something I'm looking forward to. And you need to think about this. You need to think about how your staff feel about it and what they need to do. The second one is a picture of a screen put in place. And I think this shows a workstation which is a little bit more sensible, a little bit more manageable. Yeah, it's a practical solution. It does reduce the transfer, but again, it's still a screen, and that's something we need to avoid. If we can implement social distancing, if we can do things like that and make changes to the business so we don't have to put the screens in, it's much better. One of the reasons for this is cost. We've had enough cost with our businesses at the moment. We've had enough disruption. We don't want to have to spend money we don't need to. So physical barriers and PPE is always the last resort at this one. But if you're going to do it, it needs to be in a way that's actually usable and actually manageable for your business and your employees. I brought on these couple here, and to be honest, I've put these in more as a bit of a laugh, if I'm being honest. But I'm also going to say, think outside the box. Think outside the box. And the first one here, which is the pool noodles, to show the 2 meter. Now, I was somewhere in Germany, and that came about a few weeks ago now, and I just thought it was great. But one of the things I'm going to say, the reason I put that one in is because you'll remember that. You will go away and you'll remember that now. And hopefully, if that's the only thing you remember, then hopefully it will ensue that you actually think about, I need to do that risk assessment. I need to actually think about what I'm going to do and the ways I'm going to do it. I'm not saying you need to get all your staff walking around with pool noodles on the head, definitely not. But, you know, think outside the box. The second one, I think, is a really good example. It is a restaurant, so it's not so relevant, but it might be for break rooms and stuff like that. To ensure social distancing, I think this was in Singapore, the restaurant put a panda, a cuddly toy, on every other chair. I think that's one of the best ways of pushing forward with social distancing because it's fun. It doesn't take away the interaction. It doesn't make it too clinical. It's a fun way of doing it, and it works. People follow things that they actually want to do, things that they feel confident doing, things that are fun. So do think outside the box. Bring things in if you can, and it's not always possible, but bring things in if you can, which make people smile. We need a lot of smiling at the moment. We've had enough misery and things, so let's make people smile to try and come up with ways outside the box. Okay, so key points. Again, key points we need to think about. First of all, when you're doing your risk assessment or risk assessments, because I dare say most of this will be several different risk assessments, you need to consider all aspects of the workplace. So I've put here, including things like car parks, break rooms, washrooms, entrances, how people travel to work. I went past a factory by me the other day, and they had loads of social distancing things in place. You could see as soon as people arrived, social distances were in place. A bit further on, up the road, at the end of their car park was a smoking shelter. Not anything at all. Nothing at all in terms of social distancing. So they missed that part of it. You need to think about all aspects of social distancing. As I said, and I'm trying to get this in because a bit like the traffic light thing, if I tell it enough, that it might, hopefully people remember it, is if any employee shows symptoms of COVID-19, no matter how small, they should not attend work. That is very, very straightforward. And the next one here is you cannot discriminate against any employee. This hasn't changed any rules. As I say, it hasn't changed any health and safety rules. It certainly hasn't changed any discrimination rules. And it's a very hot topic at the moment. But don't discriminate, whether that be for somebody for pregnancy or race, religion, anything like that. Regardless of what it is, you cannot discriminate. And that's something you need to think about when we're looking at COVID, as well as any of the other aspects of the business. And that's the thing, COVID-19 does not supersede any existing health and safety legislation that's in place, or any other legislation that is in place. It's just a new threat that you need to consider. Paul again touched on this one about social distancing. If social distancing cannot be maintained, it is not to say that it cannot take place, but you certainly need to consider whether that activity needs to take place. It doesn't say that you can't do it. You might have to put other things in place, but not everything needs to carry on. And one of the things I'm going to say here is those meetings. Does that actual meeting need to take place? Can we reduce down that meeting? Can we change how we do it? Can we look at doing it via Zoom, WhatsApp, or something like that, instead of having that face-to-face actual meeting? Again, reducing that down to zero. And that, I think, should be extended as well to, does any activity actually need to take place? Because if the activity doesn't take place, we don't need to do it. We don't need to risk assess it because it's not taking place. So I think extend that not just to the places which social distancing can't take place, but any aspect. I've put language in here because all aspects of health and safety need to be fully communicated. It's an important thing. Think about your workforce. Think about who they are. Make sure they understand it fully. And certainly, I know, certainly around by me, a lot of factory staff may not be first language in English, and it is something you need to consider. I'm afraid the fact that they didn't understand it is not an excuse. You need to think about them and understanding it. And I mentioned this before in terms of making risk assessments readable, making sure it's of a readable size to them. And when I say that, it's how long should it be? Don't make it too long, but also provide it in a language that they can understand. And the key word there is understand, along with signage, etc., etc. The fact that they didn't read it is not an excuse. Okay, so on to the main parts of what the legislation, I say legislation, the advice says. One of the things I'll say at this point is the advice changes. The advice changes on a regular basis. Only in a couple of hours, there's going to be another briefing by, I say, somebody in the government, whether that's Boris or somebody else, and there may well be additional information. So again, you must review this going forward. But this is as of current as of today. The first one is that access to work, people coming into work. And it says, I put there, encourage people to walk or cycle. Get people out in the fresh air. Yeah, people are walking or cycling, there's less chance of transmission. I'm going to make a point here about, again, that transmission and how it works, and go back to what social distancing is. Let's think about smoking. Let's think about smoke. If you've got smoke outside, it disperses. It disperses very easily, whereas inside, it disperses a lot less easy. So getting people to walk or cycle to work means there's less chance of that transmission. There's more social distancing as well. And the other benefit is health of your workforce. A more healthy workforce, hopefully, will actually improve mental health, improve production, things like that as well. So encourage people not to use public transport. And like I said, I'm not looking forward to going on public transport myself. And I'm sure a lot of your employees will be in exactly the same boat. This might mean you need to look at extra bike racks, places people can store their bike stuff, their bikes, etc., safely, securely. You might look at your cycle to work schemes, whether your employees can access cycle to work schemes to gain new bikes and things like that. So have a look at all those policies and try and build those into encouragement. It shows you're a good employer at the end of the day. If nothing else, it shows you're a good employer, which has a benefit, even if you have a very low take-up on it. Touch points, we need to look at the touch points. Now, okay, main ones that I will say that I'll highlight. Clocking in. So this is ID cards and things like that. There's something which gets touched often. Swiping them through a system or using a keypad or something like that is a high touch point. We've all seen the Mission Impossibles and that, where they've sprayed something on and can see what the most touched buttons are, and all they need to do is work out what they are. Or if they're the most touched buttons, they're also the buttons that are most likely to be, I'm going to say, infected or contain the virus. So let's look at removing those if we can. We've seen this in shops a lot with contactless payments being increased in value so that people don't have to touch those keypads. So maybe you look at ID cards over swipe cards, showing the card to security rather than having to type your name in. We might look at removing the signing in sheet so that there's not a pen which is being touched and a piece of paper that's being touched, more for a very straightforward register, a bit like the old classroom register, where we can see whether somebody's there. We might look at the doors, automatic doors over normal doors, or even just the fact that the first person props the door open at the start of the day and the last person closes it at the end of the day. Very, very straightforward, cost effective in that respect, provided it doesn't affect any of your other risk assessments, an easy way of reducing down the touch points in that one. Hand washing always has to be up there, I'm going to say almost as number one, because from the very start of this, the advice has always been, and this goes across any of the WHO advice, any of the NHS, etc., is always about washing your hands. And it's always been about washing your hands in soap and water. So yes, hand sanitizer is extremely important. Hand sanitizer is often one of the ways that we can easily implement hand sanitization. But don't forget hand washing. Don't forget that good old soap and water in the same way that we've done for years. That is the best way and the cheapest way to actually reduce the spread. So I'm going to say encourage that hand washing on the entrance and exit of any building. If you can get people washing more regularly, the spread is reduced. But the main one here is going to be at the entrance or exits of the building. Now, for a lot of people, that's going to be a case of using alcohol hand sanitizer. It's going to be using things like that, because you can put the little squirty bottles next to the door. So have a look at implementing that. But if you can implement that in straightforward hand washing with good old soap and water, that's got to be the best way forward. Paul spoke about staggering shifts, and we've spoken about that as well. Stagger shifts so that people don't attend at the same time. That might only be by 5 or 10 minutes, but it reduces down those sort of crunch points. And we all remember going to school and the bell going off and trying to get through the door and about 5 people kind of cramming through and everybody getting stuck. That's what we're trying to reduce. 5 or 10 minutes is all we need to do to reduce down that numbers. So have a look at your shift patterns, stagger those. Try and create one-way systems within entrances, exits, and generally around buildings. If you can create a one-way system and have different entrance and exit points, again, different entrance and exit points for different teams and things like that, it reduces down interaction. We're looking at reducing down interaction if we cannot reduce down those touch points. So a bit like we've seen the announcement of the bubbles, of people having these bubbles now, bring that system basically into your workplace. So you might have one team having entrance point A, team B having entrance to point B, etc., etc. On walkways, use tape to reinforce the social distancing. And as I say, Paul had a great picture of this one with just tape on the floor showing what 2 meters is like. Most people do not know what 2 meters are like. I've got to say, I'm one of those. For me to say 2 meters, would I get it right? No, I definitely wouldn't. I'd hopefully get it fairly close, but I wouldn't get it right. So use those markings to show what 2 meters are. In the same way as you drive down the motorway and you see the chevrons, you're meant to be, was it 2 chevrons apart? How many times have you pulled back and gone, oh, actually, I'm a bit close? Oh, yeah, you are right there. That's what it does. And again, let's look at the change into the 1 meter rule. All we're doing then is adding an extra piece of tape down if we want to change that from 2 meters to 1 meter. Very, very little cost involved there. It's a little bit of sticky tape at the end of the day. Really good, effective, cheap way of introducing social distancing. So let's look at the factory settings. And I said most factories will have more than one setting that they'll have to consider. So they may have to consider things like offices, deliveries, vehicles as well. But I'm going to talk mainly about factories at the moment. First one is still work from home if possible. Yeah, I know, not the most practical for most factories, but there will be some staff which may be able to work from home, so admin staff, things like that, or some staff which may be able to work from home for some of their work. So consider that. You will need additional cleaning. And I've put workstations in here, but it's throughout the whole site. This is doors, anything like this, but anywhere where people are going to be working. I would encourage self-cleaning as well as cleaners at this point, because if people are self-cleaning, it just makes it less to do going forward. And I'll also include a clear workstation policy. Most of you will do that anyway, where you've got no personal items and it's a clear desk, I'm going to say, policy. As I say, most factories that is implemented anyway, but make sure that is now implemented, because the clearer it is, the easier it is to clean. But I certainly would allow people with, I don't know, maybe a bottle of antibac and a wipe, or pack of Dettol wipes to clean their workstations regularly. Try and keep teams fixed together. Now, this might be within one building, this might be within one area or anything like that. It's keeping those bubbles together. That way, if one person is infected, they are only infecting a small number of people around them. And it's not being spread across multiple people, multiple sites, multiple buildings, things like that. If you can, keep that down to partners. Now, this also might have a huge advantage with you because people work well with other people. If you get a regular partner, you get to know what they do, you get to know how they work, and it will not necessarily be detrimental to the business to work in those teams, to get those teams up and running. Social distance where possible, but if not, or if you can anyway, work back to back or side to side rather than facing each other. Again, think about how it's spread. Think about that social distancing. It's spread by vapor. Vapor gets pushed out of your mouth and goes forward. It doesn't go backwards, or not very much anyway. So if you've got somebody behind you, they are much less likely to be infected. So do try and work back to back or side to side where possible. So stagger shift times, but that also comes on to break times. Yeah, you can still use canteens, you can still use breakout areas. You may need to make changes to those, and I will talk about that as well. But if you we stagger those break times, you can have less people in there, less people affected. And this kind of comes back to the fixed teams and partnering. Maybe you are going to have fixed teams to use one break area or another. The other thing I'm going to add into this one at the moment is ventilation. And we've spoken about sort of cycling to work, walking to work, having that added effect there, good ventilation. Well, I think this comes into your workplace as well. Having those doors open will have more fresh air, which is always good for the health, always good for people working, but will also hopefully push through any vapor, push it out of the site. And this kind of again comes into breaks as well. You can encourage breaks outside. If you can encourage people to get outside, there's more space. There's less likely of transfer because breeze and that will blow it away, and it's much easier to implement. For some people, 2 meters can't be maintained, and certainly on some sites that's not possible. Certainly some jobs that's not possible. So what do we need to do in this situation? The first one is hand washing. We increase that hand washing again. We've increased it already, but this is a place you must increase that. And again, if that can be with soap and water, that is preferable to using hand sanitizer. But make sure at very minimum people have use of hand sanitizer. Erecting screens, we've seen pictures of that, of erecting screens between workstations. As I say, this is the last resort. This is always the last resort. It's not a case of, oh, I'll do that and I don't have to do anything else. I will say at this point though, is come back to that making your staff feel safe. And I'm talking about this about what you have to do. What you might do is more than you have to do, because doing more makes people feel safe. And although people don't have to wear masks outside, how many people have you seen queuing up wearing a mask when there is no legal requirement for them to do it, but they feel safer doing it? And you need to make your workforce feel safe. I've put in there restricting access, fixed teams, partnering again. Again, there's a little bit of trust here, but also the main thing there is it doesn't spread. It doesn't spread past those fixed teams. And I think if you've got teams that can't work more than 2 meters apart, they definitely need to be kept separate from the other teams that you've got. They will be sort of in that bubble because you don't want that spread between anybody else. More cleaning, hygiene. Again, we're talking about workstations, things like that, that you're going to need more cleaning and hygiene in those places. Think about the jobs that they're going to do and try and prioritize the jobs where there might be high risk of transfer to low risk of transfer. And if you've got to have certain areas that are working within 2 meters, it's the low risk ones that should be doing that over the high risk ones if possible. Most people won't have that option. Most people won't have that option, but that is something you need to look at. Communication is one of the other ones. I've put communication for picking, etc. So this comes down to depending on what your factory does, and think about the processes involved. You got to think about the people as well. If you can use electronic communication, there is no touch, or the person is touching their own device. Yeah, that they're touching maybe, I'm going to say, a mobile phone or a tablet, which means the person sending that information is no transfer there. So paperwork is not transferred. So if you can use electronic, that's great. Most people are fairly au fait with tablets and mobile phones and devices like that these days. And we've seen that with this lockdown. People have also got much more confident with it. How many of you would have jumped on to a webinar 6 months ago? My parents now use Zoom on a regular basis, and they're in their late 70s. So I think there is a lot more confidence with using technology. So now might be the time to introduce this technology, to look at ways you can, I'm going to say modernize, but make things more efficient as well. Maybe now is the time to go paper-free. Now is the time you need to think about these things while people are accepting the changes, not just under the COVID side of things, but because they're more confident. Use it to your advantage going forward. I've put use radios and phones to reduce movement around site. Again, we're looking at efficiency here. So some of these things here, which you can bring in to reduce the spread, hopefully will increase efficiency, and your staff might be a bit more willing to take it on because there's another reason for it. It's not a change anymore. It's not a change because they said, oh, why don't we do it the old way? The old way worked perfectly fine. It's a case of there's a reason for it, so people are more likely to take it on board. So radios, phones to reduce movement on site. Delivery comes in, I'll phone the person up. Where do you want it? Rather than having to walk around and ask, where's so-and-so, where's so-and-so, 10 minutes have suddenly gone. That takes a very short period of time. Think about drop-off zones for parts and things like that. So you might have areas and stillages where parts are held, so people aren't having to walk around site. There's a small number of parts and you've got one person moving from site to site. That is reducing contact. One person's job. So an example would be you have a stock controller who is on the radio, for example, and will go and pick the piece of the part that somebody needs, goes and takes it to a drop-off point, drops it down, goes and gets another part for somebody else. The person who needs that part will go and pick it up from that drop-off zone. Less movement about because neither of the two ever meet, and nobody's in one area, nobody's in the other. That reduces down congestion, reduces down the spread, but again, may well help with efficiency because you have one person who knows exactly where everything is, one person knows the stock, things like that. So not all of the things you put in place will have a detrimental effect to the business. A lot of it may well have a improvement effect as well. Don't share workstations at all. If you can do this, great. So your workstations should be assigned to one person. Things like forklift trucks and stuff like that. As Paul said, in ARCO, as soon as the workstation is assigned for that shift, it's assigned for that shift and then cleaned at the end of the shift. So that is something you need to look at doing. Tools are the main one I'm going to mention here because that's the one thing that people often overlook. And pens. I'm going to say pens at this one. How many people, can I borrow a pen? Can I borrow a screwdriver? Can I borrow something like that? Something very small. Yeah, no problems. Try and discourage that sharing of tools or any items between one person and another. You might need to look at what you need. And a lot of this is going to be small tools, small items. And again, may well increase efficiency depending on how it's implemented. Think about your supply chain and how that's implemented. Think about your supply chain and what measures they're putting in place. Because that might also not only change how you operate, because deliveries are smaller, deliveries are larger, deliveries are less often, or there's changes there, you can't get things. So there's those practical measures that you need to think about, but also think about how they're delivered. What does that mean? Where they're coming from? What's the implications there? Hopefully a lot of things that's not going to be necessarily COVID related in terms of transmission, but certainly less packaging, things like that will reduce that transmission. Most of that's more going to be from a practical measure going forward. If you are making any changes, especially with things like shift times, break times, stuff like that, you need to consult any workers, trade unions, employee representatives, or anything like that. When you're implementing any change, they need to be agreed. And like I say, most people understand this. I don't think if it's done sensibly, there's going to be any objections anywhere along the line here. But you do need to look at consultation. And some of you, depending on what the changes are, depending on the size of the business, may have to do a formal consultation for your workforces and your businesses before any changes can be made. This obviously has time implications. This obviously has cost implications because of those time implications. So it's something you need to think about and look into straight away. Communication is, again, the main part of this one. You need to communicate, and it's just communicating to those people, communicating what you're doing, and don't just implement things. See what people's views are. And I'm going to say here as well, one of the first things that I'd be doing is talking to my employees and seeing what their concerns are, what they're worried about. And maybe it is a case of most of my employees come to work on the number 38 bus. So therefore, they're worried about coming to work. They're worried about that transport side of things. And you can start looking into how you get around that one. What can you do to get around that one? And there are options. There are always options. It's just about finding out which ones they are. Think about the main ones here. Think about the areas that are used by more than one person. So this is vehicles, tools, workstations. One thing we want to avoid here is people jumping in, I know, a forklift truck or a van or something just to move it out of the way. So you've got to think about how people move around site. You've got to think about all those little interactions. And whereas before, if a van was unloading and it was in the way, and somebody just go jump in, move it a few yards or whatever, because it's a company van, not think anything of it, you might need to be a little bit more, like I say, clued up with where people park, how access, egress, and all those sort of things are taking place, how people know which forklift is theirs and not somebody else's, etc., etc. So consider that movement around site. Okay, let's look at break rooms and canteens. And the first thing here is you can open up break rooms, you can open up canteens, but there will be things you will need to put in place. First one is manage those occupancy levels. Social distancing still needs to be maintained. And I'm going to say at this point, social distancing has to be maintained because there is no reason that I can see that you can't maintain social distancing in break rooms and canteens. So have a look at that one. How to do that? Well, stagger break times, more break times that are shorter maybe. There's lots of different ways to do that one. You reduce the numbers in there. If you reduce the numbers in there, you don't have as much of an issue of having to rearrange things, having to change things around, because you've done it as that first number. As I say, you think back to those two numbers, get that first number down as low as you can first of all, and then look at the second number, see if you can reduce it down to 0. Like I said, encourage those breaks outside. You've got space outside. There's more space outside, and we're coming into the summer, or we are hopefully in the summer. Although looking outside at the moment, I'm not so sure. But try and encourage people to take breaks outside. So maybe make a nice area, cordon off a few car parking spaces where people can have some chairs and sit outside, sit in the sun. Not only, as I say, fresh air does people good, but you're also increasing your space. You're also reducing down that spread. You might want to think about smoking type shelters, which are not for non-smokers. So areas which are covered, covered over, areas that they can be out of the weather, out the worst of the rain, but still be in a well-ventilated outside area. Consider ventilating your canteens and break rooms. Just open the windows, has a dramatic effect on the spread. And just little things like that will help the from the communication and help people feel safe, but also reduce down that spread. So opening windows and silly things like that. Do think about smoking shelters. Do think about those areas that a lot of people don't think about too much. I'm somebody who very rarely thinks about those because I don't smoke. But it is an area, it is still part of the business. It is still something you need to consider in your risk assessment. How do those work? How many people are going to be able to access those? Do you need to put more in to mean that there's more space for people to socially distance during a fag break or while they're having a smoke. Canteens, well, one of the things that is very clear throughout all the advice given is it's reducing movement, it's reducing travel, and they don't really, and the government's advice is not really for people to leave site if possible, because that's more interaction with more people, more chance of spread. So first of all, encourage people to bring a packed lunch. That means you don't have to open your canteens up. It means there's less spread, there's less contamination, there's less interaction, and they don't have to leave off site. You might look at providing cold sandwiches or something like that, which is again less interaction, or maybe bringing in a sandwich van or something like that, so that people don't have to leave site. If normally in your situation you don't have a canteen and people would leave site, maybe look at arranging for your local sandwich van to come and serve people at your site at certain times. But think about if that's going to take place, think about those occupancy levels, think about your break times, think about when people and the pinch point of that queue to get the bacon sandwich or whatever. Think about how you're going to manage that. You will have to review your cleaning here, and as I say, self-cleaning is one of the best ways forward. So provide the cleaning materials for people, and that can, as I say, just be a bottle of antibac and some wipes, something like that, so people can clean between use. We might be talking something simple like a kettle here. Yeah, if you can get the person giving it a wipe down before and after, less chance of spread, because you're hopefully getting rid of the virus at that point. And this is where a sign works. This is the area you should have a sign, and this is where a sign will continue for the rest of the business time. A bit like you go into the toilets or something, it says, please wash your hands. People do as they're told. Generally, people do as they're told. So putting a sign up saying, please wipe down the surface after use. People do as they're told. It's clear, it's concise, it's simple, and people will do it. People will do it. Reduce shared items. Reduce the use of shared items. So again, this might be cups and things like that. Items that might be shared, you need to reduce down. But it also might be things like kettles and stuff like that. You might say, well, I'm going to put more kettles in, make some more small break rooms so that teams are smaller who are going to be using them. Very, very simple and a fairly cost-effective way, depending on your setup, to reduce down interaction. So reduce those shared items going forward. Showers and washrooms. Again, we've spoken about encouraging people to cycle to work. So showers are something which comes in here, and that's why I've left showers in here. But washrooms is what we're mainly talking about. We're talking about, your toilets and stuff like that. Now, for most factories, I know that you won't have communal washrooms or showers or anything like that. But for some of you, that may well be the case. If that is the case and you're sharing it with more than one business, you need to speak to that other business, and you also need to speak to the landlord of the property to see how things are going to be implemented and have a clear, concise way forward for any person using it. What you don't want is your business saying one thing and the other business who's using it saying something else. So make sure you speak to your landlord. You will need to increase the cleaning of these areas. That will be the case. It is a high risk area. Doors, for example, are the first one. Yeah, so you will need to increase the cleaning of these areas. And one of the things that has been implemented in pubs for many years, I've seen, and certainly in some factories, in some offices as well, is the straightforward inspections. Inspections and sign to say that it's been inspected or it's been cleaned at a certain time. It's a very good visual way of seeing that things are being done correctly, that it is safe, that it has been increased, and it is that communication point of view. This doesn't just apply to showers and washrooms, this applies to the whole business. So maybe canteens as well, maybe workstations. So you might implement that somebody has to sign a sheet or have some way of signing a sheet to say, I cleaned the workstation at the end of my shift, I cleaned it at the start of my shift. Again, just think back though, unfortunately, which makes it a little bit more difficult, about that shared items and reducing pens and stuff like that. We might need to think of a different way of doing it, but it can just be a straightforward tick or initial. There are ways around it. Encourage self-cleaning. I know I've mentioned this several times, but that's sort of, I've made short cleaning in between to encourage people to clean themselves as well as your main cleaning regime. And these self-cleaning regimes are always as well as. You may need to reduce numbers, and we saw that ARCO have reduced numbers in theirs, in their toilets to, I say it's 2 in the example we showed. So look at how that might be implemented. Look at the capacities, and there I will say toilets and washrooms and things like that are often very small rooms, and it's very difficult to social distance within, especially in the doorways and stuff like that. So you need to think about that sort of process. If you can limit them to certain staff members, so you might have one for team A, one for team B, etc., etc. So you're not having people walking around the site to try and find a toilet, especially if you've reduced down occupancy levels. If you reduce down occupancy levels and there's 2 people in the first one they come to, are people going to move on to the second one? Then the toilet a bit further on down, and how does that impact in terms of interaction? So you may want to reduce down in the team numbers who are going to be using these areas. Sanitisation stations, hopefully people will be washing their hands. Hopefully that is a fairly common practice even before this happened, and with a little bit of encouragement, certainly a common practice now. But again, maybe it's a case of as soon as they get back to their workstation, a little bit of hand gel, something like that. Make sure that there is less travel, less contamination around the site. So provide that ability for sanitisation in addition as well. Let's look at meetings now. First of all, avoid any unnecessary meetings. Avoid any unnecessary meetings. If you don't need them, don't have them. That means the risk is 0. There you go, job done. But look at remote tools. And I've said Zoom, I've said Microsoft Teams. Again, people are a lot more comfortable with this going forward. People are a lot more comfortable with things like social media as well, and try and implement that. Implement that into your workplace. I think it's a great way forward of increasing efficiency and recording as well of these meetings, in addition to reducing down the risk. So maybe toolbox talks don't have to be in that meeting room anymore. Maybe they can be via Zoom, via some other means. Maybe there are those options. And again, you know your staff, you know your teams, you know how you operate, and only you can really look at the best way forward. But don't forget that people's lives have changed. People have changed. People have become a lot more acceptable for use of these remote devices. Even in the last few weeks, there's been a massive change. You can, or you should always really maintain social distancing within meetings. You might need to look at your meeting room, the places you have these meetings, and reduce down the numbers. So it may not be the whole team, it may be parts of the team or sub teams that have these meetings, and you have to have more than one of them going through. If you can, I'm going to say hold the meetings in ventilated rooms, but preferably, again, look at holding them outside. You know, not only is there an advantage there in terms of being outside and fresh air, not taking up the space. Maybe that office that or meeting room you used to have can be changed into something else because you've created another space which is more usable, more user-friendly outside and allows social distancing outside. But it does have the effect of reducing down the spread. And that's what we're ultimately looking at doing. So maybe look at holding these meetings outside. But certainly you need to maintain social distancing within the meetings. Encourage use of hand sanitizer before and after these meetings. Again, Part of this is going to be for confidence. Part of this is going to be to stop the spread. But having the ability for that, as well as cleaning of, I'm going to say, chairs, desks, meeting tables, pointers, anything like that, make sure that there's the ability to clean before and after use, and encourage people to self-clean, to use that hand sanitizer between meetings. Avoid shared stationery, pens, pencils, notepads, etc. So this might be your signing in sheet. You might need to look at different ways of recording the meetings. And this is where, as I say, I come back to things like Zoom, Microsoft Teams and stuff like that. If you can introduce some of this, then that has the ability to make things be recorded in a very easy manner without the use of people signing to say that they've been in that meeting. Maybe it's just a tick item in terms of, again, you have the register in the same way as we looked at the ID. Have a look at ways you can avoid that. And don't provide the stationery like you used to go into a meeting and have a board meeting with a pad and a pen even. That's something you want to avoid at the moment. So let's look at contractor visits, deliveries and restocking. So again, this is people visiting site. This is people visiting site you can't stop. Paul did mention that they have stopped all non-essential maintenance at the moment, or during this crisis. Now, that's something you're not going to be able to do forever. You're still going to have maintenance and that going on. So you need to look at that going forward from now. You may be able to stop it in the short term. You may be able to reduce it down, but you will still have to have it going forward at some point. But look at ways you can reduce contact, especially when we're talking about deliveries. ARCO introduced the fact that drivers didn't need to get out of their vehicle. They'd have a drop-off area where they would be able to be unloaded without getting out. If they do, maybe there's a drop-off area. If you're getting lots of parcels, things like that, you might have a parcel drop-off area. So an area where drivers can put the paperwork and not have contact. Again, reducing that contact. Single workers to unload, this might mean additional measures. Forklifts, but in the obvious one, palletize things. And you might need to think about your customers here, that they're going to want some of this implemented. So maybe you need to look at how you package things to make it easier to unload with just one person or by mechanical means. Reduce access to areas. So maybe delivery drivers can only access certain areas of the business. Again, reducing the impact, cross-contamination between teams. So it might be they only can go to the warehouse. They can't go to the shop floor. They can't go and use this. And this comes down to hand washing facilities and stuff like that, and toilets. You might have a separate contractor toilet, which keeps it away from your teams. So reducing access. Use of radios and phones, mentioned this before. Have those sort of intercom sort of systems rather than have somebody walking around site trying to find somebody to sign a document or something like that. Very, very cheap to implement. And again, most people tend to have at least one mobile phone these days. A lot of people have more than one. So, it's something which hopefully be fairly easily implemented with very little work. Look at times of your deliveries and look at when your cleaning is. When I say times of deliveries, if you can establish deliveries maybe when there's less people on site. So at the very start of the day before shifts have started, if you've got somebody on site, they're taking the deliveries come, or very end of the day. You know your site, you know how you operate. Are you a 24/7 operation with less people at certain times? You know when that is. Certainly you want to avoid deliveries at changeover times of any shifts, because that's when most people will be on site and more people will be on site. Not only that, efficiency wise, it's not the most efficient time for a delivery. So restocking, I'm going to say out of hours at this one. Encourage contractors to access the hand washing and hand sanitization facilities. So anybody coming on site, whether that be for delivery from DHL or Yodel or any of these sort of people, or whether that be a pallet line delivery, or somebody coming and doing some maintenance, encourage them to wash their hands before they access the site. So some people may not need to, it's just a parcel force delivery, but let's say somebody's coming to service one of your items, just ask them, can you go and wash your hands before you access the site? Reduces down that spread. That kind of brings me on to cleaning. If your site has been closed down for a while, you will need to look at cleaning before starting work. I mean, that's good practice anyway. Hopefully that's good practice anyway. Now is the time before you actually start get it clean, get it all set up, get it looking right before we start work. You may need to look at other existing risk assessments, and I've put air conditioning on there. Now, whether that's relevant to you, as I say, it's down to your site, but let's think, if you've been offline for a period of time, you may need to look at things like your Legionellas. They have said that air conditioning should be safe if it was safe before, but if it's been closed down for a while, you may need it serviced, because that's air conditioning systems. You have a look at your risk assessment currently for that one. Have a clear cleaning policy and make sure that's communicated well. So communicate that across. But certainly high touch items, I put printers, doors, workstations, things like that, need to be cleaned more regularly than other areas. So have your way you're going to maintain that cleaning. We've spoken about that so many times. Keep personal items away where possible. Uncluttered areas are much easier to clean. Much easier to clean. So have that clear desk sort of policy on across the whole business, whether that's in the office, whether that's in the workstation, whether that's in the company vehicle. And I think company vehicles is probably the hardest one to implement it to. Have that sort of clear desk policy. And review the times in the same way as deliveries about when that's going to happen. And that will need to be reviewed when there's the most use of it. So maybe before and after break times are time when it's most use, so therefore cleaning needs to take place, but also when it's had less impact on social distancing, less impact on the business. And provide sanitisation in multiple locations, especially in high contact areas, especially in doorways, especially in access points, which is the main areas that people will be coming in and needing to use that hand sanitizer. And ensure people use it, ask people to use it. People will use it if they're asked to. So a nice big sign saying, please wash your hands, please use hand sanitizer. Or just when you're talking to somebody, yeah, go and do it. Can you go and wash your hands? Can you go and use hand sanitizer? It's company policy. Lead by example is the other one. Make sure you're doing it at the very minimum. So let's talk about PPE very briefly. I'm conscious of time on this one, especially with if there's any questions. So if you're currently using PPE for anything which is, I'm going to say, non-COVID related, it still needs to be used. You've done a risk assessment on it, so therefore it still needs to be used in the same manner. The current advice, and I say current advice, and this is something you need to keep very much abreast of, is that workplaces should not encourage the precautionary use of PPE to protect against COVID-19. So that's basically saying you're not encouraging people to use it. It's not saying don't use it. It's not saying people can't use it. It's saying you're not encouraging people to use it. And this comes down to your risk assessment. If you think about it, the first thing we need to do is remove the risk. The very last thing we do is implement PPE, personal protective equipment. I am going to say here, face coverings, which are not required by law at work, are very different to PPE. PPE protects the user. Face coverings protect other people. So we've spoke about how it's transferred. It's transferred by people breathing out. So a face covering, it's not sealed. It's not a sealed device. And what it means is that moisture goes less of a distance, I'll say, than if you weren't wearing a mask. And that's what a face covering is. That's what we have to wear on public transport, things like that. PPE protects the user. That's for articles or particles being inhaled in. So there is a difference between them. When we're talking about face coverings, if people want to wear face coverings, I'd say let them do it, because that's making them feel safe. Nothing else, it's making them feel safe. Regardless, let's ignore anything else, but you have a duty to make your staff not only be safe, but feel safe in what they do. So I'd say, you may not say that people have to, and like ARCO have done there, they're not saying that people have to wear it. But what they are saying is if you want to, go ahead, use it. Not a problem at all. We don't have any issues. So you don't have to put PPE. There is no PPE you have to put in place unless your risk assessment really says it has to be, because it's very close contact workings or something along those lines, which is very much unavoidable. But hopefully we've all ironed out that before we've got to this stage. If you are getting PPE, do make sure that they are the correct items and go through the sort of check-in process. There are lots of dodgy items on the market. There are lots of, I say, Chinese, Korean, various types out there which are not CE marked. So you're looking for CE marked on any of these. Again, ARCO actually have a very good website with some information of how you can check whether they're correct, whether they're legal, I'm going to say, items of PPE. But you should do that. If you are providing any PPE, regardless of whether it's for COVID or anything else, you need to check that is compliant. And it's your responsibility to check that it's compliant. Communicate all the measures across to everybody. And that's to your staff, but also to your customers here. So make sure you share those risk assessments. I can't encourage you to do that more than I possibly can. That is always the best way forward. Encourage that communication. When you've got somebody who doesn't want to return to work for one reason or another, it's not often the fact that you haven't put things in place. It's usually the case that it hasn't been communicated effectively. And I use the word effectively because it might be the way that it's communicated. You think about who your staff are, think about how they react to things, not how you react to things. So you've got to think about how they react to things, what they see in terms of communication, and communicate it in as many ways as you can. So share your risk assessments, use your signs, use tape, use your social media feeds, use your website to show what you're doing. It works not just from a communication for you to make sure people actually adhere to it and actually feel safe to it, but it also works from marketing. And at this time as well, you need to think about all aspects of your business, including that marketing side of things. It's good practice to do it. Finally, is existing risk assessments. We spoke a lot about changes to the business, propping doors open, changing numbers of people in break rooms, changing break times, things like that. So we are going to have to review other risk assessments to see how this new way of working is going to interact with them. The main ones that people will have to look at, I'm going to say first one is your fire risk assessment. If you're propping doors open, having different changes in automatic doors, different changes in how people enter, access things, teams which are, I'm going to say, not able to access certain areas, your fire risk assessment is something you will have to review. Now, hopefully, there may not be any changes. Hopefully, you'll be able to make some changes which will be able to be implemented in that as well. But you need to look at that. You need to consider that. Legionnaires is another one. And we mentioned about air conditioning, but this also is in sort of pipes, washrooms, things like that. And you may have a site that's only partially closed down. So certain areas of that site, those certain washrooms may have been out of action for a long period of time, and they may need a deep clean. They may need tanks emptying, things like that for the Legionnaires. Lone working, home working policies. So if you've got people who are now working from home more regularly, you need to look at the policies there. You need to look at how they are impacted. You need to look at what equipment they might need. And again, lone working is the other one. You may have reduced teams down to smaller teams. There are risks involved in that. There are risks involved in unloading, especially if people are working on their own. So do look at your lone working policies and the policies of your other risk assessments, such as unloading or loading of vehicles where somebody's doing it on their own, possibly unsupervised at that point. Final thing is mental health. Mental health is a massive thing at the moment, and change is what is the main, I'm going to say, cause of mental health issues. Unknown is probably a better way of putting it, the fear of the unknown. We are in a situation where it is very hard on people. People are having to juggle things like working from home. They're juggling childcare. They're juggling changes in their job. They're juggling financial uncertainty with things going forward. So consider your mental health policy. A lot of this can be neglected with your communication. So again, if they fear change, communicate what you're going to do so that they know what the changes are, so they feel more confident about it, and that will help that side of things, help that side of mentally. But you will need to consider that mental health policy and see how that affects your business. At the end of the day, a happy workforce is an efficient workforce. And that's what we're trying to gain here. We're trying to create a confident and happy workforce. And that's going to make it a lot more efficient. So a little bit of further information there. I'll leave that slide up a little bit. I know these are fairly long sort of links here, but there's 2 or 3 on here. 2 or 3 I'm going to mention. First of all, .gov.uk is the best one by all means. It's not always the easy one, but it's probably the best one because it's got up-to-date information. So have a look at that. HSE has some really good information as well as Public Health England. And as I say, I put the ARCO one on there because they've got the risk assessment which you can download and some really good information, especially on PPE. So you've got really good information on how to say what is sort of, like I say, true PPE, because there are, as I say, a lot of fake items out there. So do have a look at that one. Now I'm just going to go on to sort of any questions. So if anybody's got any questions, let's have a look if there are any that have come up. Second. So, okay, so the only question I've got here, some employers have introduced temperature checks, and if it's above 37.8, you'll be sent home immediately. Is this a practical control measure? Ooh. That's an interesting one, really. I think certainly some of this, you're going to have to think about your staff a little bit. I think that we are getting very, very close to some of the rights of employees here, and that's something you're going to have to be careful of. People generally are fairly flexible at the moment in terms of control measures put in place. But it is something I'm going to say, would I feel comfortable doing? Certainly, I know a lot of schools and nurseries. My lad's gone back to nursery today, and he had to have his temperature taken before he was allowed in. So I know a lot of places are implementing it. Is it practical? Depends on your workforce, I think. It is a control measure. I don't know whether that would actually show that there's an infection there, because is it part, I don't know. I'm going to say on that one, I can't answer that one in any sort of good format, because I think it comes down to your risk assessment. I think the main thing we're going to be saying here is, if you've got good things in place, good communication in place, good policies in place, hopefully employees won't come in if they're feeling unwell. And that's the first thing. You don't want them even coming to that point, because somebody's got to take that temperature, and that puts them at risk. So first point, you don't want them coming in. Secondly, if you're putting no social distancing in place, then hopefully risk is fairly or reduced anyway. But certainly I would say if they do have a temperature, you don't want them to come in. And that is one way of doing it, certainly. But just be a little bit careful there. I think we're probably getting very close to that sort of what you can and can't do in that aspect. one thing we know, there's going to be a lot of grey, there's going to be a lot of things going forward in terms of this is unprecedented, this is new, and until things get put in place, we don't know whether that's practical until people have tried it out for some of that. So apologies if that's not if that's a little bit of a political and not the best answer, but that's probably the best answer I could give at this moment. I think actually that's the only question we've got. So if anybody's got a question, do put it in there, and I will sort of try and answer any questions that people have got. But finally, I just want to say thank you very much for attending. I know I have run over slightly today, but there's a lot of information to get through, and so I wanted to make sure everything was covered. I want to say thank you very much to Paul from Arco for such a detailed, I can say, walk round of what they've done and the practical measures that they've put in place. So thank you very much, Paul, there.
No problem at all, Peter. Thanks for having me.
I'll also sort of mention the Humber Growth Hub for further information. We are recording today's session so that it can be played back. Do go onto the humbergrowthhub.org /COVID-19 for further support, but also for general support in terms of supporting your SME business. They do have a lot of support available, whether that be COVID related or non-COVID related support. So thank you very much. And if there's no other questions, I'll let you all get off for the rest of the day. So thank you very much, Paul, and thank you for attending.
Thanks, Peter. Bye-bye.